Right, I want us to get into that discussion now. Of course, it's 1 year since the Sudanese war, and in studio I'm joined by Flavia Mongovia. She's the Deputy Regional Director for Amnesty International. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Right, just from the story we've seen, what is the current status of humanitarian aid delivery in Sudan?
Wow. Yeah, the numbers are quite concerning. It's numbers we don't like to repeat, but we have to repeat them because it really outlines the gravity of the situation. So 1 year later, we are looking at around 14,700 people killed, about 10 million people displaced, right. About 9 million of which are internally displaced in Sudan, and 1.7 to neighboring countries such as CAR, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. And we have some of them here in Kenya, right. And neighboring Uganda. Currently, we're looking at Sudan being the largest internal displacement crisis globally. We are looking at Sudan on its way to being the largest hunger crisis globally if something is not done soon. We have acute and severe acute malnutrition of children. About 1.4 million children, half of Sudanese children need humanitarian assistance urgently. When you talk about women and mothers, women who are pregnant and mothers, we're looking at around almost 250,000 in urgent need or in a situation of severe hunger. So it looks grim. It looks really grim as of today. Yeah.
Because even with the numbers you've given, it looks very deep, you know, the numbers of people who have even lost their lives. And, you know, at some point, actually, people say it's one of the forgotten wars right now, as much as there's also conflict happening in other parts of the world. But I know there are aid organizations in that country. What are some of the challenges they're facing at the moment?
Yeah, no, on your first point around the forgotten war and a forgotten crisis or forgotten conflict, I'm hearing that quite a bit from different corners. I think it's important to say that indeed, we're in a situation of multiple crises globally, so that is not lost to us. We are fully aware that there's crisis and conflicts in many countries, including in the region. But it is not forgotten. To the Sudanese community, the Sudanese people, this is an everyday reality. What is happening is that I think largely our efforts do not globally and regionally and in the sub-region do not demonstrate that we are aware or we are fully cognizant of the gravity of this conflict. So I think there's a level of, yes, it seems forgotten, but no, it's not forgotten to the people who are touched by it the most. So we need to do more to bring action and proper action on this matter. So I think on the second question,
was asking, there are aid organizations in this country, a lot of humanitarian organizations. What are some of the challenges you think they're facing?
One of them is access. Both parties of the conflict have really curtailed access to the people and the communities and the populations who are really in need of this aid. So humanitarian access where it's needed is really a great challenge. The other one is just really also the resourcing of the humanitarian support. I don't know if you're aware, but yesterday there was a big conference in Paris, a pledging conference, a humanitarian pledging conference for Sudan. As of, I think the last time I checked the statistics of the UN appeal, because the UN usually sends out an appeal for funding for humanitarian response, it was only at 5%. So imagine if you have to respond to a crisis and you need 100 million and you only have 5% of it. What does that say in terms of your ability to even meet the need? So there's a question around access, indeed. It's a problem. It's just very difficult due to the ongoing fighting and just the disruption of humanitarian access, the looting of humanitarian supplies, but also from an international community perspective, it is not sufficiently funded. Far from it, actually, because 5% is really low. I'm looking forward to seeing the outcome of the conference yesterday. I haven't checked. I need to see what that has led to in terms of concrete actions and outcomes.
Let's talk about now the essential services the conflict has affected in terms of access to healthcare, which is very important, water services, and even education for affected populations. What are some of the things that you've seen is happening when it comes to this impact of access?
So I don't have like a front row seat on that in terms of data, statistics or numbers, but just from conversations with our partners and others who are working on this, there's a huge challenge because not only are we seeing just acts of violence, which means people need to access hospitals, and the number of hospitals or even first primary care providers that are able to function optimally are very low. You're hearing numbers as 20% in terms of hospitals, but that's hospitals, because normally when you're sick or you have a situation, you need like a health center, a dispensary before even you get to the hospital. So there's a question around just the disruption of the healthcare system in the country. That's one. And then also the ability of the system to provide specialized care to particular groups, whether it's children, immunization, because a child who's born has to be immunized at a particular time. Whether you're in conflict or not, that need does not go away. And then you have rampant cases of sexual violence in the context of the conflict, as Amnesty have documented, conflict-related sexual violence. We have situations where women are raped, others are held in conditions alike to sexual slavery, where what is your first line of response in terms of healthcare? To be able to get either a prophylaxis, to prevent against STDs, if you have women, just other complications that are arising from that violence. It's really, really a situation that's quite dire on its knees. Yeah.
In any conflict, women and children are the most vulnerable groups. And also you've mentioned 9 million are displaced in that particular country. I want to talk about Amnesty. What is Amnesty doing in terms of measures? Or like just human rights cases like this, what is Amnesty doing to protect them?
Yeah, so our work takes several aspects. One of them is really around advocacy and really prevailing upon different actors at the regional and the global level to take certain measures. One of them is really around protection of civilians. We are saying that according to international humanitarian law, civilians should not be targeted in the context of conflict, but it's happening. For us to have 14,700 people killed, it means that is either in deliberate or indiscriminate attacks against civilians. So what Amnesty is doing is documenting. One of them, the things that we're doing are really documenting and using what we're finding in our research and documentation for advocacy purposes. And one of them is really pushing for an accountability mechanism because Sudan is where it is because of impunity.
Right.
Because of impunity. Remember last year when this conflict started, we were about to commemorate 20 years of Darfur.
Yes.
So some of the key perpetrators are the same perpetrators from that time. And they have been emboldened because there's been no action taken against them.
Right.
So we are pushing for justice and accountability in the context of this conflict. And we want the regional African Union mechanisms and the global UN mechanisms to be at the front line of that.
Do you think they're doing enough?
Well, no. Sorry to be so blunt. No, it's not enough. And I'm speaking not just as someone working at Amnesty, as a Kenyan citizen, as a sister to Sudanese brothers and sisters. No, I don't think it's sufficient. I think we have seen efforts, diplomatic efforts by different countries with different interests, whether it's the US, UAE, Saudi Arabia. We've also seen the UN, African Union. But what you're seeing is more like several actions, but not coordinated, not coherent, not strong enough, not timely enough. The UN Security Council called for a cessation of hostilities and access to humanitarian actors in Sudan only almost a year later to the conflict. So no, it's not sufficient. And that's our call yesterday when we go to the 1 year mark. Can we see more concerted, coordinated efforts towards ensuring something gives in a positive way for the people of Sudan?
You talked about hunger crisis in Sudan, that it's about to be the worst. What do you think humanitarian organizations are doing, or are they doing enough to address issues like food insecurity and malnutrition among children? It's difficult to place a value of whether it's enough or not, but I do know that there are really coordinated and lots of efforts to try and ensure that this situation is turned around. Remember, it's not just Sudan affected, because you have people who have also been displaced externally. There are people in Chad in IDP camps, people in South Sudan. And remember, South Sudanese were also refugees in Sudan. Now you have double and triple refugees. Right. So this is a problem for the region. So it's a question around, are the humanitarian efforts being supported? And one of the question is around the funding appeal, the question around access, and the question around ensuring that you're reaching not those just in Sudan, but also in the neighboring countries to ensure that everyone who really needs the aid and the support is impacted. But remember, before we even talk about humanitarian access, Sudanese people, just like other people in other countries, are able to farm, they're able to grow their food. Right.
So the question of food security is not purely one of access, it's about the repercussions of the conflict, because infrastructure has been destroyed. People are displaced, which means they're not able to plant when the planting season has come. It means you're not able to access the supplies that you need. So these are people who can be very self-sufficient and independent. But because of the conflict, the only conversation you can have is around humanitarian access, which I think is quite unfortunate. Yeah.
You know, when it comes to conflict, of course, people are affected mentally.
Yeah.
So is there any psychosocial support for most of the people who've actually been traumatized by the conflict that's going on there, especially women and children?
Wow. I cannot even imagine.
Yeah.
We've not had access to Sudan because of the conflict, but we've had access to people outside of Sudan who've been impacted by the conflict. Right. And the trauma is real. The psychosocial effects are real. So we can only support to the extent possible externally, maybe through just referring to trauma counseling and things like that. But in terms of just a systemic approach to support the communities impacted with mental health, counseling, trauma counseling, I'm not even sure if that's featuring amongst the the priority of the different actors. And I think it's something that's very important you've raised that we need to elevate and see that is adequately responded to. But for now, I can't speak to it directly, but I can say I agree. It's something that we really need to look into, and we are doing so to the extent possible.
Yeah. With how dire the conflict is, of course, the economy is not in a good place. Do you think there's hope for the people of Sudan to rebuild their lives?
Oh my goodness, we have to.
Right.
Really, we have to. Yesterday we had an event in Nairobi where we were celebrating Sudanese art and culture. Right. Sudan is very big and it's known for its art and its culture. But imagine the number of institutions, archives, cultural institutions, museums that have been destroyed by this conflict. So while the people have escaped with their talent and their skill, the institutions that safeguard the history of this country are suffering, and some have been destroyed. Yeah. So no, there has to be hope. We cannot afford to lose hope. What we need to do as Africans, as Kenyans, is to stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan, people-to-people solidarity, and see how we can make noise that we do not have further destruction in this country, that the people of Sudan are able to go back home and rebuild, and those who are there can already begin to do the work. Yeah.
Let's go back to the humanitarian aid workers who are in that country.
Yeah.
Are they protected enough? Because a lot of the times you find there's a bit of misunderstanding even with the locals there. Is there any mechanism usually to protect them?
Well, international humanitarian law does provide a framework for that. They ideally should not be targeted, like civilians and so on and so forth. Yeah. But we've seen statistics where we've seen humanitarian workers even killed in Sudan, especially in the early days of the conflict. So in terms of adequate protection, I can't speak of the current situation because I'm not a humanitarian worker, but I'm interfacing with them. Yeah. I would say we still need to do more to ensure that civilians, humanitarian workers, and people who are responding to the conflict, including doctors, do not fall victim to violence in the context of the conflict. The parties need to respect humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, and ensure that they're not targeting deliberately humanitarian workers.
Right. Yeah. I want to talk about the role of international community in all this. I just want to take you back a bit and talk about a country like Rwanda, for instance. They marked 30 years since the anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsi. And also we saw the president coming out and saying that the international community failed them. Yeah. Do you think the international community is failing Sudan at this point?
If we continue the trajectory we are, and if certain things do not give, if we do not see more concerted effort, more coordinated effort, more coherent effort, then indeed we will be failing and continue to be failing the people of Sudan. I think 1 year on, it's really a moment of deep introspection and really a moment to shift gear. And that's why we need the help of everyone, including media houses and journalists such as yourselves, to really make noise and really to put this and say, no, something has to give, and we need more action, more intentional, like really robust action, both at the African Union level, IGAD, and also at the international level. We have the fact-finding mission that was established by the UN, but it's not resourced adequately. We need it resourced. We need it to be able to be activated to do the work that it needs to do.
From Amnesty's perspective now, there's a lot of human rights issues around the world at the moment. Is there any specific that you'd like to point to with regards to also what's happening in Sudan?
Well, it's to say that we're in a region that's, we have countries that are quite volatile in terms of just the situation with the conflict. We have the DRC, we have Ethiopia that we're looking at, we have the situation in South Sudan that's also monitoring and all. So this region is characterized by, unfortunately, crisis and that we need to see not as isolated sometimes. We also need to see what can we do as the African people to ensure that we have more robust leadership, especially from our African Union, where they're able to respond and react in a very decisive manner when we need them to. So I think it's the crisis that I would say is one of those that we really need to look at, and the question of impunity, because most of these crises are fueled by just rampant impunity, where people get more emboldened and keep perpetrating more violence and more violent acts against the civilians and populations.
Let's talk about, I don't know if you'd want to talk about even the political instability, of course, in Sudan is what is causing all this. And the country, even after they removed Omar al-Bashir, now it's kind of gotten worse. What do you think then states, heads of states in different parts of Africa should do to ensure that this conflict is sort of subsiding?
I think it's, we talk about African solutions for African problems. I think those African solutions should be solutions that are geared towards looking at the best interest of our countries and our states and our people, and not the interests of our individual leaders and politicians. I think our heads of states need to embody the ethos of the African Union, and the African Union also needs to show up more strongly, because we start from home. We start from home and then we go elsewhere. So the solutions have to come from us, and African heads of states needs to embody those values that we have set out as an African people, which put the people first and the interest of the people first.
Coming back to Amnesty, is there any specific campaigns or initiatives that you've put in place to, curb such situations, especially in Africa?
For now, there's a campaign we launched yesterday where we're calling for an arms embargo. So we have seen that the flow of arms, we have an arms embargo existing over Darfur from the conflict 20 years ago. So the UN Security Council passed an arms embargo, but we are seeing that it's not being respected. We are seeing a flow of arms into Darfur and to the rest of the Sudan, and those arms are what are being used to really against the civilian population. So the campaign is really calling for the UN Security Council to enforce this arms embargo and to also extend it to the entire territory of Sudan. So we have a petition that's out. If you check our website, amnesty.org, you'll find this petition. So we are calling for everyone, including yourself, to sign this petition and to really push for action. That's the first campaign that I can talk about. There's more that we are doing in different contexts, but I can stop that for now.
That's the ideal one that you have that's latest.
At least that's related to the current issue.
Does Amnesty collaborate with the international organizations that deal with human rights?
Yeah, definitely. We cannot work alone. Amnesty is a big movement, 10 million plus people around the world. But we cannot work alone. We work with partners, both at the international, regional, and at the country level and the local level. The event yesterday was not hosted by Amnesty alone. We did it with the NGO International Film Festival, the Sudan Democracy First Group, Sudanese artists. So it's really in our DNA to work in concert with others.
What about, are there specific strategies that Amnesty employs when it comes to awareness of human rights abuses around the world?
We have a very big human rights education program. Human rights awareness is really not a preserve of human rights workers.
Right.
It's for everyone. And I think the world will be a much better place where everyone, our children, and the people around us understand and embody human rights values and principles. So we have a human rights education program that seeks to actually ensure that we keep inculcating human rights values, knowledge and principles to different audiences, be they young children, be they young people, be they the elderly, be they specialized groups. Yes, it's really a core aspect of our human rights work.
I mean, also just looking at what the kind of technology that we have right now around the world. I'm sure Amnesty is up to date with some of the technology that they have, but when it comes to, documenting violations around the world, is there specific, unique technology that you're using at the moment to ensure that you have the right statistics, the right numbers?
That's a good one. There's a good old pen and paper, but of course technology has really evolved, including with artificial intelligence, which has its pros and cons, which I cannot speak to. I'm not an expert, but it's one of those that we're looking at to see how we can deploy. But digital channels are a key platform for just getting information and data. They also allow us to access areas that we cannot access, because if, for example, Sudan is a conflict, you can't go in there. So how can you use tech to be able to understand what's happening and connecting with communities on the ground?
Right.
So that's one way. But in terms of statistics, and we rely mostly also on UN statistics, you know, credible institutions that do this all the time to be able to get credible, because Amnesty prides itself in impartiality, its authoritativeness, its credibility.
Right.
So it's important that we work with data and statistics that are actually robust and checked. Yeah.
Okay, as we wrap up the interview now, maybe now, what is your hope for Sudan?
Oh, my hope for Sudan is that that first of all, the able to reclaim their country. They're able to reclaim their country. Those who are in there are able to live safely and continue their day-to-day business and reestablish their lives. My hope for Sudan is that the world and the people of Africa can rise up and say enough, and not just for Sudan, for people of DRC and other areas where there's conflict. So I'm hoping we can see more action, more voices, more anger, more outrage, that we can have severe acute malnutrition, that we can have so many people dead, we can have people raped and abused and so on and so forth. Right. So I'm hoping that with what we have been doing in the past couple of days, will be more awareness and more outrage and more action that will translate to some extent to the people who really are key, the states, to do something, including the African Union and the international community.
Right.
Yeah.
Very well said. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right, that is Flavia Mongovia. She's the Deputy Regional Director, Amnesty International. Of course, we're talking about the Sudanese crisis that has now just marked 1 year. Right, I want us to take a short commercial break here on Africa Speaks. We'll be back with more, but first, Destination Africa.